like to just say a few words before we get started. I'd like to encourage everyone, if you don't have a membership, that you might want to become a member here, because the membership benefits are really great. For just $25 for a senior, $35 for a individual, and $45 for a family, you get all the research you can handle. You can come to the museum for tours as many times as you want, and we're working on members only programs. So you know, we do have a lot of things. We also have a 10% discount in the gift shop. So another thing is, if you're not a member, if you don't want to be a member, we do take donations. They're always appreciated, and we do have a donation jar over on the table by the refreshments. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Gayle Bundy, our speaker today. And Gayle is the co-historian, along with her sister Katherine Bundy Locke, of Homer Semnightly Literary Club, and their mother and grandmother were also members of the club. So we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you for coming, Gayle.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning. This is exciting. So everybody's interested in women's literary issues in the early 20th century. You're in the right place. I'd like to introduce my sister, my co-historian, Katherine Bundy Locke, without whom this project would not exist. We both grew up in a family where our mother and our grandmother and some of our aunts were members of the Semnightly Literary Club. So when we were little girls, what we knew about literary clubs was that once a year you had to clean the house like really thoroughly, because all the ladies were going to be coming to your house for the program. We also knew that there would be another time of the year when your mother was like unreachable because she had to prepare her paper, her program. So that was kind of, you know, what we knew about Semnightly as little girls growing up. We both moved away. When we came back to the area, we were invited to be in the club, and then they made us co-historians. So at that time, quite frankly, there were a lot of members who really didn't have family history, and they didn't have a real. So Kay and I set out to like re-educate ourselves and our members about the origins of the group, because no one knew what the name meant. So that was one of our first questions: is what does that mean? So let's get a couple of our questions. Make this work. Okay, page down. Okay. So some of our questions, and this presentation is actually a compilation of two that I've done to Semnightly. I'm doing a decade every year, so I'm mushing together 2 decades into one presentation. So the first one was from 1903 to 1913. How did Semnightly get its name? Who were their early members? Who were they? What were they about? And then what were their programs like? What were they interested in? And when we started, there was a whole lot of missing documentation in the beginning years. And we started recreating by going into our favorite reference source, FultonHistory.com. Is everybody familiar with FultonHistory.com? Well, it's a Mr. I can't pronounce his name, Tom Fulton, basically has a life's mission to digitize every newspaper in the world. And he started in Fulton in central New York, and it's a fabulous source. He now has the Cortland Standard, Homer Independent, Homer Republic. He has all the Cortland papers are all in the system. They've just gone in the last year. So you can search on lots of different things and find out lots of different.
It's free.
And it's free. So that was what we were interested in that first decade. The second decade, we were looking at how their interests changed over time. And how do they react to key events? Education, women's suffrage, and World War I. Okay, so how did it get its name? Actually, Semnightly was part of a national women's club movement that occurred post-Civil War United States. With the Industrial Revolution, more women began to have leisure time. And with leisure-saving appliances, and they also had increased education, but very limited ways of expressing their education, because there wasn't a lot of career paths open to women at that time. There was also, in that time period, created a literacy requirement for citizenship. So many women's clubs started as education clubs, both on the coast particularly, as ways to teach other women, help them get their literacy skills so they could get their citizenship. So many of the clubs in the Boston, New York City area, your coastal cities, that was a big driver for clubs. In 1890, a General Federation of Women's Clubs was founded in New York City, and by 1899 it was estimated there were over 1,200 women's literary clubs in the United States. Many different types of clubs. They had different focuses, cultural preservation, social activism being one, to dignified labor. They had both suffragette clubs and anti-suffragette clubs. Establishing day nurseries. There were clubs that's all they did was work on developing nurseries. Literacy instruction for immigrants, but expanding understanding of the world was a big one. So many of these clubs had a very literary history orientation. And another key thing I found was research that most of the public libraries in the United States were actually started by women's literary clubs. They would have their books. They would get books, they would read their books, and then start a little lending library in their own communities. So that was kind of an exciting thing to discover. So the first club in Homer that we could find is called the Leisure Hour Club. So then, women started to have leisure. So there's a little bit of, just step across, I'm going to pass around a couple of photos. These are all on poster boards, so I've got other copies, so don't worry. So here's a meeting of the Leisure Hour Club around about this early time frame, meeting in people's homes. They met for 1 hour on Saturdays, their leisure hour. The one someone said, how did they get their time? Well, they made 1 hour for their leisure hour. This club originally focused in on travel and reading Shakespeare, but they quickly found miscellaneous programs more pleasing. And they also played a very major role in raising funds for the Phillips Free Library. In fact, Ellen Phillips, the daughter of Mr. Phillips, who gave the money for that library, was a member. And for a period of time, Leisure Hour, basically for over 10 years, all the funds raised for that library were raised by Leisure Hour members. In 1902, the Hastings family moves to Homer. Mr. Hastings was taking over as manager of the Phoenix Hardware Manufacturing Company, which manufactured hardware in Homer on Cortland Avenue, and his wife joins Leisure Hour. But their daughter was at Cornell. Their daughter had just graduated from Cornell, and they moved from another town to Homer, and she just had a degree from Cornell, and here she is in this little town. But when she was actually Sage College, which is the women's college, had a literary club called Semnightly, and that met every week. This is the room where they met at Sage Hall. I'll pass this around. Look at it. And they met once a week, every 7 nights, so Semnightly is short for 7, every 7 nights for literary and cultural discussions. So that actually transitioned in 1913 to a sorority. The Delta sorority is the, what do you say, well, I forget what the word is. Anyway, so Clara Hastings was a member of that. She moves to Homer. Newly graduated, and she forms Homer's Semnightly Literary Club. And so she started a reading club with weekly meetings. We don't have any written record until 1905 in the archives. So most of our information comes from program booklets and newspaper articles. They met in Homer's room, in members' homes. They dressed in evening gowns with gloves. They read books and papers, they did papers, and they had recitals where they played music for each other. And they had social events, and they had at least 2 to 3 papers every evening. So who were they? Many of the original members were young, educated, single, and in their 20s. Some were working and some of them. Most were actually working and some were married. This is a picture on the left is our grandmother. She wasn't a member at this time, but this is in 1903. This is when that picture was taken, so you get kind of an idea of the hat that they wore. So there were teachers who lived in a boarding house on South Main Street in Homer, telephone operators, bookkeepers, stenographers, someone worked in a law firm, carriage house, lumber, granite work, dry goods, milliners, shirt makers, and a compositor who worked in the newspaper. So these women were pretty active. So here's a picture that I got from the Historic Society. This was, I was trying to get clothing, what were people wearing? And I was trying to find pictures of actual women. I didn't have that much luck. But this is the Homer Academy graduating class in 1908, so time frame, so you can kind of see the casual wear that people would have. And at this time, there were, by 1908, 12 of the Homer teachers were members of the literary club. This kind of casual thing. So, back up. So some of these early members were lifelong active in the Homer area. Clara Hastings, who founded it, was active in both. She actually left Semnightly after a while, went back to just leisure hour. She owned the Hastings House Tea House and Gift House, also called the Woodshed. Yeah. Some people remember in Homer. Miss Martha Baker married her boss, and she was the treasurer. She was the first treasurer of what we now know as the Brewster House. Very active in fundraising. Mrs. Katherine Newton, that we will learn about a little bit later, was the postmaster of the Homer Post Office. She also was the founder of the Homer PTA. Miss Jenny Wood was a teacher for many years. There's still a Jenny Wood Award. It's given to the 8th grader with the highest grades. She also, as we're kind of, she also seems to be the person who recommended the most risque books for people to read. So that's kind of a little bit about who they are. We have Kay's figured out. She's got the ages, the occupations. We have little bios of all these women that Kay has put together. So what are some of the early themes? What were they looking at? The first year we have a real record of is 1905 and 1906. So they're meeting every week, and they have a different author every week, and they have 3 to 4 papers that are assigned. People were assigned papers. They had to do research and come up with, and we know what the topics are they had on each of these. They had to do from the little booklets and also from the newspaper articles, because they were very good about publicizing everything. Mm-hmm. So we were able to reconstruct quite a bit from the newspaper articles of the time. You notice they also had a dance and a colonial party. Well, that dance was a pleasant dancing party. They invited gentlemen friends, because most of these ladies were single. About 25 couples attended. And the hall was attractively decorated with Japanese lanterns, because Alice Roosevelt, the daughter of Theodore Roosevelt, president, had just been to Japan on a mission, which there's some really, on the political side, there was all kinds of nefarious stuff going on politically between the U.S. and Japan at the time. And she was sent along on the mission as a publicity distraction, so that people would look at her and follow her activities and not follow what was going on politically behind the scenes. But Japan became the rage because she was the young, exciting young woman in the White House, and all the young women wanted to be like Alice. They also had, in February, they had a colonial tea. This is at the home, it's now Kim and Beth Hubbard's home. All the women dressed in costume, historical figures, both male and female. They had cake, they made poems, and they had a most enjoyable evening with no colonial men present to make afraid, except the ones represented by the young ladies. And we'll see this theme going on as entertainment, that for at least 20 years, once a year they would do, one of their meetings would be a theatrical meeting. But let's just look at what was going on in Homer at that time. I'll freeze. I just froze it. I don't want to freeze it. I want to unfreeze. An elephant got loose on Main Street from the circus. circus house. I mean, those of you who know, we have the circus house, so we had Sig's Hotel, and we had the circus, and he's kept circus animals in what's the octagon-shaped building that you see going to Homer. Well, an elephant got loose in November, and they had to chase it down Main Street to try to capture it. There were 5 fire hose companies, and they competed with theatrical groups. There was a lot of theater going on. These 5 groups, they were all volunteer firemen, and the hoses then were on carts that you pulled by hand or by horse. So they had to be in different locations in the village, and they had, I think anybody who was young in this arena was an actor or an actress in these plays. And most of our young ladies in Semnightly were very active in these plays. The editor of the newspapers complained about rude and unmannerly children in the library. The Newton windmills were partially destroyed by fire. The state gave $5 million to pave the road between Homer and Scott. Well, it wasn't paved before that. And North Main Street was under quarantine for scarlet fever. A lot of stuff going on here. The next year, their whole theme was on Japan. Again, Alice Roosevelt influenced there. And you can see very detailed. Each of these items is one of the papers that was read. It had to be researched, very, very detailed. They've now changed to 2 meetings a month, as opposed to 1 meeting every month. And then, kind of the rest of that decade, the themes are pretty standard for a literary club. 1 year's art and architecture in Rome and Italy, very much European, history of England, United States history. 2 different years developed to the history of the United States. 1912 and 1913, they did a history of the American people, where half the year they spent exploring American Indians, and then they looked at different ethnic groups and immigration. So, they're starting to get a little more, I would say a little more political, maybe. But 1914, the next year was a big change. I looked at the program for the next year and I flipped out. It was like, the theme was the kitchen. And I was like, oh my God, the kitchen. I mean, here we have these ladies doing all this exploring the world, and suddenly the kitchen. So, I have to stop that, but I'll get for it. But they also were doing leisure hour in Semnightly. What we figured out was that many of the young women in Semnightly were the daughters of women in the leisure hour club. And so anytime leisure hour club had a banquet or anything, the Semnightly ladies would wait on the tables. So they had every Washington's birthday, they had a fundraiser for the library. People would go to church on Washington's birthday, and then they would come to the library for a fundraiser. But anyway, so now we're getting into the second decade. So I said 1914. I have to figure out what's going on, because this kitchen thing is kind of really bothering me. But we can see from these 2 years, the hens go, and we have a major shift in programming going on. So this is 1914. This is where I started, just to give you kind of an idea of the dress, and the pictures I could find. So Jenny Wood here is the teacher of the 8th grade, and she took the students on a buckboard ride up Brake Hill. They had a picnic up there, found that newspaper article. Mm-hmm. She's the person that they still have a Jenny Wood Award in the 8th grade in Homer. She's also the one who recommended the risque reading materials. Mm-hmm. So she was considered people talk about her in the newspapers being just a lot of fun. Then we have 10 years, a few years later, we have the Homer Academy faculty. So we could see how the hems have gone up, and got a very different style, short hair. There are 3 members who are on the faculty. Miss Stoker, I had Miss Stoker. You had Miss Stoker. I mean, she was still teaching math 50 years later. And I don't think she was any happier either. sorry, but she lived to be 100 years old. So I thought it was kind of give it kind of a picture of what was going on. I mean, just the hem change alone in that time period is pretty amazing. And so, but now, what I began to realize when we were looking at the women and who they were, many of them were now married with children. Many of the single people were married, and one of the research things that Kay had to deal with was that we'd have a roster that would have the members, and we have single members, Miss this, and then Mrs. would be the husband's name. Suddenly the single women would disappear from the roster, and we would have new married people, and figuring out like who married who, and is this person still a member? They just got married, or they drop off? That was one of the research questions. But so we have many people now who are married. This happens to be a picture of our grandmother who joined in. This is the year she joined. But she has like 5 kids, and so her life was a little different. So that year, 1914, these members are very active in Homer, but we have to remember, as someone over here was saying, they didn't have the right to vote. They were cooking and heating over wood or coal. Childbirth was at home. They traveled by horse or train or foot. Electricity, was just recently wired. Homer wasn't, and they didn't have radio. Their photographs were crank. Their sewing machines were treadle. And they were supplementing the family income by raising cows, chickens, and gardens. And we have in our own family archives, we have our grandmother's journal from her selling cows, her daily journal of selling her receipts from selling milk. So this is something that you can look at afterwards if you wish. So life has changed a bit for these young women who are now kind of growing up and have a few more responsibilities. But still, they're still intellectual. And this is a very challenging decade. There are 3 main things going on in doing the research, we see, and trying to figure out. Okay, come on. Okay, no. Come on. Okay. I found that there were 3 major events that really impacted the club. One is World War I. 1914 is when the war was announced. That's when the assassination of the Archduke in Austria occurred, and that's when Germany started its actions in the war. But it wasn't until it was 3 years later that the U.S. entered the war. But there's all kinds of things going on at this time around the war. Women's suffrage. Although they didn't have the right to vote then, in 1914, the National Federation of Women's Clubs endorsed suffrage. They had 2 million members around the country. 1915, there was a women's march in New York City. 40,000 women marched in New York City. And then in 1919, the U.S. Congress passes the 19th Amendment. So this flurry around suffrage is going on. But, the kitchen is still bothering me. We think that, it's like a whole different thing. What we don't know, what I didn't realize was that the whole business of studying home economics as a science was very new. And the pioneers were in Cornell. A woman by the name of Martha Van Rensselaer started a reading club for farmers' wives at Cornell in 1900. In 1907, another woman joined the Cornell College to teach home economics. 1911, the first 3 students graduated who had a degree in the science of home economics. In 1912, those 2 women became full Cornell professors. And in 1914, the land-grant colleges were, the co-op extension movement was started with federal funds. So Cornell was really in the lead of all of that activity going on. And in 1923, the League of Women's Voters named Martha Van Rensselaer one of the 12 greatest women in the United States. So when I went back to look at the kitchen programs, discovered that these two women, Martha Van Rensselaer and Flora Rose, were the guest speakers for their first meetings on the kitchen. So our women here were very much still very connected in with Cornell. It was still very much a scientific, intellectual activity to really study home economics and the newest technologies. So if you think about, again, a picture of the kitchen in 1914 to 15, the one on the left is kind of a Stanford, Connecticut, model kitchen for someone who's very wealthy. But the one on the right is probably more realistic to what people were dealing with in terms of what a kitchen might look like. And home economics as an academic science is also very intertwined with women's suffrage. Over here, here's a picture of the National League of Women's Voters. Here we have Eleanor Roosevelt, but over here we have Martha Van Rensselaer, the person who founded everything at Cornell, very much involved in the national activity. And so the first Semnightly kickoff, these two women were the ones who kicked off the first year in the kitchen, and they would come back several years, down the road to do programs on the kitchen, various kinds. So what would the kitchen look like? 1914 to 1915, the program reflects this diversity of interest of what's going on in the world. So home economics, we have all of these things that they're looking at. What's the ideal house? Labor-saving devices, the use of a fireless cooker. Wow, who ever heard of a cooking without a fire? The laundry, saving steps and strength. Some of those we could still see in our women's magazines today. Uses of eggs, cooking of vegetables, preserves, and condiments. Because our women would all be doing all these things. But their program also begins to reflect the social and political. They have programs on women's suffrage, past, present, today, and foreign women's suffrage. The peace movement, unemployment, municipal Christmas trees. What that's about. And islands that were now being thought of. So there's but we still have our basic Longfellow, Mark Twain, the poets, the great men of our time. Not quite the point where they could have great women of our time. But so that's just this is like a huge shift in the programming for this organization. That's one of the things I found pretty interesting. And these mixed programs continued into the 1915 and 1916. So we have food values. Cornell came and did that talk. Sugar as food, milk and cheese, meat, vegetables. And there was a note on the home economics meetings, a little asterisk to say, for the home economics meetings, it is suggested that the members come prepared to take notes. School teachers running this thing, but then political, they looked at Egypt, Japan, and they had a debate. Resolved that suffrage should be granted to the women in the United States by an amendment to the Constitution. So they had three people who had to take each side and debate it. And they also had book review. Call of the Blood, that's the one that's a little risque that what's her name? Jenny Wood recommended. Keeping up with Lizzie. She was she traveled around the world, so it was she'd gone to Russia, and so it was a book of her travel things. Call of the Blood, which I downloaded and have on my Kindle, it's a very weird book. But it's about a woman who falls in love with someone her family doesn't approve of. I guess it's not much different than anything else. But then they go to France, and he's young and a hot Latin, and they have trouble. And it was so boring I couldn't finish it. But it was just very interesting. But you could see how at the time it would be a very interesting book for these late, they switched away from Longfellow and those guys. A little racy. Yeah. And the other one was about a person who had gone and spent time with the Dowager of China, who was the last empress in China. So a little different reading. And then home economics themes are kind of part of the entertainment. I have to read you something. It is just really kind of delightful. I mean, they have, so here's a meeting in 1914 where they invited the leisure hour and Semnightly to often meet together, mothers and daughters and friends. About 60 ladies, including Semnightly Club and 20 members of the Leisure Hour Club, who were Semnightly's guests, enjoyed a delightful evening at the home of Mrs. L.M. Austin. Oh wait, this is not the one I was reading. Oh, there's a different one I wanted to read, but anyway, I'll go ahead with this one. So this is about Miss Martha Van Rensselaer, head of the Home Economics Department of Cornell University, and Miss Flora Rose, well known as authority in dietetics, were present and spoke. Miss Rose gave a carefully thought out and extremely interesting talk on human nutrition, handling her subject as only an expert could and delighting her hearers by only her subject matter, but by her command of simple, understandable English and charming personality. Miss Van Rensselaer spoke briefly and informally, telling of the work of the department, and now through the State College of Education, of which it is an important part, this work is being extended and helping thousands throughout the Empire State. Too much could hardly be said of the pleasure and profit received by all who listen to these two women, who are doing so much to help the girls and women who are in touch with their personality and work. The house was prettily decorated with sprays of asparagus. But the other one I did want to read is about the social event that had a play where they debated, this was a debate, debating the relative merits of the pin and the needle. Have you ever thought about that there's, which is better, the pin or the needle? Well, they did. The important question of the relative merits of the pin and the needle were to be settled for all time. The club president had assigned the question to Mrs. Cramden and Mrs. Slade, and more able and eloquent advocates could not have been found. Mrs. Cramden presented the arguments in favor of the pin, breaking forth into poetry and continuing in the same as long as rhyme and meter held. Nothing was forgotten in the pin's favor, and every phase of the subject was presented from the rolling pin down. It seemed as if the needle would be minus point as well as head at the close of Mrs. Crampton's presentation. But Miss Slade was a worthy opponent, and quoting authorities from the time of Adam and Eve down through the ages, referring to history sacred and profane, expounding the virtues of numberless kinds of needles, including Cleopatra's moth-eaten and eyeless affair, down to the tiny little bit of steel or fiber that reproduces for us Wagnerian or ragtime music. She whirled her hearers on and on, till at the close of her exposition, they were just where they were at the start and are still pondering the original question. That's a Homer Republican. That's the great fun of doing research at this time. If you get something in the paper, there's like, a lot of information. They had thimble parties where they would basically come and hide thimbles and let people search them. They had sewing bees. They had something called a roll call, where at the beginning of the meeting, every member had to come in with a suggestion on how to save household expenses. During the war, they brought sewing to the meetings to sew and work on things for the troops. So that was part of, how some of that home economics kind of slipped more into the meetings and into the entertainment. Then we have the whole thing of the women's clubs. 1914, the General Federation was at the White House. The Federation of Women's Club was using the war as recruitment. They were actively going into communities and basically saying that women needed to come under the umbrella of the women's clubs to do their part to help the war effort. Basically selling Liberty bonds was one of their efforts. Mrs. Ben Conger was the local representative, and she went around to the different literary clubs to make the pitch for them to join. They had an informational meeting with Leisure Hour. Leisure Hour did not join, but Semnightly, the young ones, decided they were going to join this national club. Katherine Newton, who would become the postmistress, was the delegate to this federation for many years. And Semnightly would be a member until 1957. Kind of what we see in the first 20 years is they it kind of made the club more structured over time. But it was interesting. The other interesting thing, in terms of a larger issue in Cortland per se, is that in 1917, all the women's clubs in Cortland met, and there were 12 of them. And they formed a Cortland County Federation of women's clubs. And they were from Cuyler, Cincinnatus, DeRuyter, every little town had at least one women's clubs. And they invited all women interested in cultivating of workmen who need not be ashamed, the uplift in education and the bettering of conditions in Cortland County. And their October program was about the clubs who were working at Fort Dix in New Jersey, the war, the Liberty Bonds, Red Cross, public health, child welfare, responsibility in schools. They had someone from George Junior Republic speak, women's work, and music and a social hour. And this was at the Health Town Hall in Homer. So women's suffrage. What we see now is their programs begin to prepare women to vote. That's their focus over the next few years. We have their first two presidential elections in 1920 and 1924. So these programs over the next 3 or 4 years are all about preparing women to be good voters and good citizens. So the one whole year they spent debating different issues around women's suffrage. Then they looked at the history of New York State and really studied it. Then they really went into studies of political parties and how to vote in local government. Then, they have the right to vote now, so now they're looking at the United States and Russia, comparing their laws, labor, and culture. And then in 1920, 21, they're into really looking at the economics of individual states and regions. So whole different, switch, kind of moving out of the literary into more social economic issues. We have a couple of years we have to still work on. The topics are not in our program books, so we're still doing research on making, figuring out what went on in those years. But 23 and 24, we start working more on Americanization, international issues, but they start to shift back towards literary. And then we get to 1924, 1925. They start to educate themselves on the presidential election. They put in their book individual studies, like one month was going to be on the Republican Party and one on the Democratic Party, and looking at local and county history. And then the big find in this research, you do this research and every now and then you come up with something really oh my God, it's really big. October 20th, 1924, Eleanor Roosevelt came to our meeting.
Wow.
I got you fast? Okay. She met with a combined meeting of Semnightly and Leisure Club, October 20th. Meeting arranged by, she was the guest of Katherine Newton, the Homer postmistress. And that's a picture of her in 1924. I'm trying to locate a picture of, could I find, did anybody take a picture of her with the Semnightly members? Don't have that. I do not know if any of you know Susan Williams, who works over at Seven Valleys Health Coalition. This is her great-grandmother. So they've sent me...
Mrs. Newton is.
Yeah, Mrs. Newton, not Roosevelt. Mrs. Newton. Okay, and that was something I saw. She signed her name, Susan Newton Williams. I'm like, are you any relation to this woman I'm trying to find pictures of? Yes, so they've sent me copies of some correspondence between Mrs. Roosevelt and Katherine Newton, but I don't have the picture of her sitting in the Semnightly parlor, at the meeting. But anyway, that's pretty cool. But the reason, what's even interesting is that what she was doing here. You know that I don't know how many of you know much about the history between the two branches of the Roosevelts. There were two branches of the Roosevelt. Great book I got at Homer Library called Hissing Cousins. Hissing Cousins. It does the biography of Alice Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, who were cousins, very similar circumstances. Parents died young. raised by the same aunt for a period of time, knew each other very well, but they were the two opposite sides of the family, because the Theodore Roosevelt family, Republicans, and they're at Oyster Bay, Long Island. And the Franklin Roosevelt family was the Hyde Park branch, and they're Democrats. And these families were basically pretty bitter rivals when it came into political activities. Hence the Hissing Cousins, which is one of the best titles for a book I've ever seen in a long time. But anyway, FDR had, 1921 was when he was hit with polio. He had been the Undersecretary for the Navy in the previous administration. But June of 1924, he'd made his first public appearance after his polio. So his wife and his family and his patriots were all trying to help him get the recognition that he needed to get back into politics. He supported L. Smith for president at the 24 Democratic Convention, which is a very wild convention. People who were talking about the conventions this year, and they were saying, when was a political season as crazy as the one we just had? Mm-hmm. They point to this year, this convention, as being the one that was really crazy, because it was a very, it was wild. It was like it took them over 200 votes to get their candidate. So he had spoken at that. He'd supported the nomination of L. Smith, and that was kind of his coming out party, from having polio. But the Dems, who already knew that Eleanor was a really, excellent speaker and could really that people were really grabbed and touched by her, they sent her out on a campaign trail. And her job was to harass her cousin, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., who was running for governor of New York. And they literally, and he had been named in the Teapot Dome scandal, which was a big, oil-related scandal of that time. They would literally schedule her to be in the same place, the same area at the same time that her cousin was going to be speaking. Wow. Mm-hmm. So, we had a crossing here of the invitation from Katherine Newton to come to Semnightly, but then also that she was, dogging her cousin, who showed up here on the railroad, the one that comes in off the Lehigh Valley Railroad, and he spoke to a group off the back of the truck, or the back of the train, and then went on this train stop. But Katherine Newton arranged for her to have 6 different meetings with women all through Cortland and Homer. So she actually ended up meeting with over 600 women in Cortland during that time when she was here. So it was a very interesting coincidence. So that was our big exciting find for this research. And now I'm basically about to the end of my presentation. A couple of things, I don't know, what's my time?
12:53.
Oh, okay, then I'll be done. I would just have some more things on some events and traditions, but I think in the interest of time, I'll just end it here, because I can't beat Eleanor. Any questions?
You spoke in terms of an event a quarter of the way through the Zimmer.
The Zimmer Hall.
Where was the Zimmer Hall?
Someplace in Homer. I haven't figured it out yet. It was a hall.
So it wasn't the Barber Hall then? It had to be upstairs in the building there.
Yeah, I don't know which. I haven't tracked that down yet.
I'll look it up. I'll see.
Yeah. Anything else? Other questions? I did bring, if you were interested, a notebook that has the programs, some of the early days, they hand wrote them out. So I have some programs and the menus from their banquets. That was a tradition. And then I have brought in one of the books of the research that we're doing. What we're doing is trying to print and capture all the members, having a database, the names of the members, bios of each of the members, printing out the newspaper articles, having it so someone can go in and read the newspaper articles. And then we've also typed out the text of the newspaper articles so that in the future historians will not have the mess that we had.
Proportionately, you were speaking about the Fulton newspapers.
Everything.
Maybe percentage-wise, did you find a large percentage on the Fulton newspaper clippings?
What would we say, 100%? 99%?
Really?
Well, when you started, they didn't have all of Cortland.
Oh, yeah.
When you started,
That's true.
Yeah,
when
they
it started,
keep
they had, I found some from Syracuse papers, but by but within the last year, they've put in all Cortland Homer newspapers.
It was sort of
on there.
like they do all the footwork, so all you
Yeah.
gotta do is take it off their
Yeah.
footwork.
And there is, it's a little strange to use the website because he's a character. But there is somewhere you can find, there is a list, it's a little hard to find, but there is a list of all the newspapers that he has in the database. And it's very, very extensive, because we're finding, we have another, I have a great uncle who traveled and talked around the whole country, gave lectures in a time frame, and I'm finding many of his articles on FultonHistory.com that talk about his travels, so it's a fabulous resource if you're doing any kind of local research for
So you can put a name in of somebody who traveled to Ohio or Michigan or.
yeah, if you put a name in and then like
Oh,
maybe
West.
some, a little more information about him, you could do a word search. And you'll get some junk. I mean, you'll get stuff that, you know, like for my uncle Harry C. Ostrander, there's also a Harry C. Ostrander in Syracuse,
Okay.
and one that's,
All right,
so I get all of his stuff too.
there's a lot of John Does, so you gotta figure out
Yeah.
which one.
So if I say Harry Ostrander Traveler,
Oh.
or I use one of the words that shows up in his articles, photographer, like I'm more apt to pick up ones on him. Yeah. Yes.
I'm really interested in how groups form in communities. And one of the things I noticed in the early list of authors they were studying, like Benjamin Franklin, Emerson, those were people that had developed really sophisticated community groups themselves. I mean, I'm sure it's probably a whole new lifetime of research, but have you found any journal articles, like how they decided to make decisions or to,
that's pretty interesting. I basically have just been focused in on, like, doing the gathering
yeah.
and not the
You've done a
analysis.
fabulous job too, by the
Thank
way.
you.
Impressive.
Yeah.
How long have you been, when did this get handed to you?
Oh, 3 years?
Wow.
I've been here 4 years, so.
Oh, okay, so they made me this.
One time, all the boxes of the club showed up on your porch.
Yeah, it was like, people said they disappeared because the person who had been a historian for years, she died and people thought that her relatives had just tossed all the stuff.
Right.
So, but then one day I come home and there's like a box on my door and there was missing.
More than one box.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we've developed it into boxes.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm a member of the Cortland County Retired Nurses Association, and within the less than 5 years, the person who took the job of being the historian, which meant taking boxes and boxes of things that had been saved since the nurses started in Cortland here, she became very ill. They were put in a warehouse and they're gone. So Fulton History might be a way to reestablish some of.
Yeah, that's what we basically use it for, was to fill in the gaps. Because, you know, there was an attempt when we got those boxes, there were some articles that people had saved, but, you know, glued into scrapbooks.
Right.
And we were really able to capture so much more. I would not have found out about Eleanor if I had been doing.
There's, in my head, there's something, I don't know who I was associated with, that talked in terms of being familiar with Ben Condon Eatery in
Mhm.
Groton. And they were just carrying on about how the Roosevelts would travel and come through Cortland to Groton to the Ben Conger because she was on her way to Cornell.
And that would be
So-
the Federation of Women's Clubs connection.
Okay.
Because Mrs. Conger was very high in the state. I mean, she basically was an officer at the state level, I believe. So with, you know, basically New York being the Roosevelt's home state,
Right.
there would have been that connection. I
That
think.
could have even been their stay over.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Even I think when he became president, I think when they would travel through and come up through New York State,
Mhm.
that was one of their stops. So there
Yeah.
was some kind of an association, personal, between them.
And also it's Katherine Newton, that'd be the
Right.
correspondence that
Right.
the family shared with me, is, and it was, you know, they were discussing a lot of things about, you know,
So
relationships.
my big concern when I go to our Semnightly meetings is that all of this stuff that we're able to find through census reports, through newspapers, is all documented. Whereas our present club members, they don't get any articles in the paper. They don't see the importance of it. And I'm thinking 25 years from now, no one's gonna be able to reestablish So it's just interesting, back in the day, people were very literal and wrote their newspapers and documented. So that's always my concern now is future reporting, because the newspaper is disappearing. Yes?
I have just the perfect solution for you. The Historical Society is going to publish a book about what Cortland is like today. We need an article about the Semnightly group. Would you guys write one for me?
Yes, I would, and I actually,
Like-
someone gave me an invitation, so it's like, my deadline is Monday?
How about June 1st?
Oh, wow, I was very worried somebody was gonna say Gayle.
No, I did talk to a couple members of your group,
Yeah.
trying to find the right person to write it.
Yeah, and they
She's
did,
the right person.
and they did tell me, I mean, they did pass that on.
Great.
Yeah.
How often do you meet and how do you join, or what is the criteria, or what is the?
We meet once a month between about October and May, June.
Right.
And they used to have a very elaborate, system for joining, but that's all gone by the way, so it's
You have to
basically,
be voted in or some
Yeah.
such thing.
yeah, that doesn't happen anymore. And basically, it's anyone who's interested in a program can come, and if they want to pay the, $5 dues or up to $10
I think
dues,
we're up to 12 now.
or $12 dues for a month, people can join. So we just had our theme this year was creative women of Homer, basically. So our programs ranged from, we just had the woman who has the new olive oil shop just came in and did her talk. We've had
Authors.
local authors speaking.
My husband sang songs that were written by women songwriters. So creative women, not necessarily
Mrs.
Homer,
Freeman.
but what?
Mrs. Freeman.
Yeah.
So
So we still have a theme every year. We've adjusted a little bit because we have a lot of snowbirds. So our January meeting is usually one where everyone comes in and who's ever in town shares the books they've been reading over the year, and we just talk about that. That's kind of fun. We now have a meeting. We do a meeting in the Homer Center for the Arts when they have the art exhibit there. We just sit and look at the art and chat. So we always eat.
well, we're not, except for Gayle, we're not forced to present programs.
But I consider this is, it's like my heritage is to present a program, so it's like I have several that I've done for them on different topics. So,
Women's clubs in Homer. Are you telling me you spoke in terms of your husband presented a program?
Singing.
So, there's no men in your club.
there's no men in the
They get
club.
invited
They-
to speak.
Yeah, they could be invited to give
Okay.
presentations. Like Bill Whiting used to do presentations
Okay,
when, dramatic things. And
okay,
so if they have something that fits our theme.
okay. So you have Mary Alice Ballardini and Genevieve Suits.
Well, those two women don't happen to be in our club, but they could be. They were probably members of Leisure Hour, which just, and
right.
Leisure Hour just ended. And they couldn't, I'm not quite sure why. I think they just ran out of energy to keep it going. So,
Everybody's running out of energy.
yeah.
Do you still meet in people's homes, or do you have a center where you get together?
We usually now meet in public places, usually, like the basement of the Brewster House or the libraries. Kay has, in the tradition, has had meetings at her house a couple of times. So,
You keep trying to bring back the old idea, but only can do what we can do.
but people are busy. Sometimes it's easier to have just go to a place. We're gonna have a meeting at the, our last meeting this year is gonna be at the
Living History
Living
Museum.
History Museum. So, try to get out. We had one meeting here a couple years ago. We met here and had a tour.
Oh, that's
So,
good. That's nice that you move around.
yeah. Yeah, I think people like that. Get a little bit more moving around, yeah. So,
But we also talked about the fact that what do you do with your archives of material? So back in our head, I don't know if the group would go along with it, but submit our books to the Cortland Historic Society. As opposed to.
Over Martin Sweeney's dead body. No.
Oh, it has to go to the Homer?
Martin says, whatever happens in Homer should stay in Homer. But, I think at some point, it'd have to be the members have to decide that we would be looking for a home for. We're trying to use archival stuff, sleeves and things for things, so.
Yeah, I'm in a fortnightly program in Hamilton, and we're going through the same discussion what to do with all the archival material. First, the question of digitizing and how to digitize it, where you won't have to keep migrating to the newest level of technology, and then where to put the physical material, because it adds up after 100 years or so.
Yeah.
The Association of Gravestone Studies ended up at Amherst College.
Really?
I guess they outgrew the people in person and that could categorize and save and keep, and so you get a college or a university with a woman's issue behind the presentation of what you have, and your connection to Cornell and interest in it. That's always the thought.
That's a real possibility, and it is one of the reasons why. I've downloaded every page from Fulton History that has the historical article on it. I'm retyping every article so that it's there is a digital record of it.
That's huge.
I'm slowing down on it, but it's like my next decade is like, oh boy, I've got. Why did they say I would do this? So,
Makes you get up in the morning.
or stay in bed and not face it. So, yeah. So
This is wonderful, wonderful program.